Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. This is Skylar Baker Jordan, and today we are going to be talking about the Munich Beer Hall Putsch of 1923 and the insurrection we saw in Washington, D.C. earlier this month. We're going to compare and contrast the two and see what lessons that we might be able to learn from history. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start by setting the scene. We're going to talk about Germany in 1923. I think it's very important for us to understand what was going on so that we get an idea of what exactly the context was for the Beer Hall Putsch. And we can kind of understand how Germany in 1923 differs from the United States in 2021. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty which ended World War I. Obviously, Germany lost World War I, in case you didn't know that. But it carved up German territorial gains in the 19th century, as you can see on this map here. Germany ceded territory to Denmark, territory to France, and it lost most of Poland, which it had conquered in the 19th century. It disarmed Germany, or at least it was meant to, and it imposed war reparations on the new German Republic. These war reparations were considered onerous and burdensome by most Germans, and they were very, very bitterly opposed by most German people. In January of 1923, France invaded Germany after Germany said that it was going to put a moratorium on the war payments. France said, no, 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 you're going to give us what you owe us, and Germany said, no. The workers in the Ruhr, which was Germany's industrial heartland, took collective action after the French invaded. This was supported by the central government in Berlin, but it hastened the economic turmoil we're going to see. So by the time of the Beer Hall Putsch, because of this and because of hyperinflation in Germany, it took 4 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread. This was a very unsustainable economic situation. And so the Democratic Socialist government in Berlin ended collective action against the French in September of 1923. Now, this infuriated both the far right and the far left. So you have people like the Nazis who are furious, but you also have people like communists who are furious at this. Because of this, not Hitler, but the central government in Berlin institutes a state of emergency, which is to last through February of 1924. The Bavarian officials, now Bavaria is a state in southern Germany, they're unhappy with this, and they refuse to recognize Berlin's authority to impose a state of emergency. Instead, they go ahead and institute their own state of emergency. And there are legitimate fears in Berlin and elsewhere that Bavaria might secede and reinstate the old monarchy. So now we're going to talk a little about the formation of the Weimar Republic and why I call it an accident of history. We just sort of breezed through that opening slide there, but that's okay. Here you see the old German Reichstag building. The German Republic was born, I think it's important to note, that it was not born of a revolution like the United States, nor was it born of a commitment to democracy, nor did it evolve as British democracy did over the course of centuries, but it really happened quite by accident. So Friedrich Ebert was the leader of the majority Social Democrats, and he actually wanted a constitutional monarchy, not unlike what Britain had. There's Ebert right there. Woodrow Wilson, however, wanted to see the end of the German monarchy. Woodrow Wilson was the United States president at the time. And so that's what happened. Now, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, communists of the time, they really wanted to proclaim a Soviet-style republic. And Luxemburg and Liebknecht especially wanted a Soviet-style republic. They didn't get it, and in fact were murdered for their efforts. If you're interested in left-wing thought in the 20th century, I would suggest you check out both Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. But that's not the purpose of this video, so we're going to go ahead and move on. When they got wind of what the plans were, Philipp Scheidemann, who was also a majority Social Democrat, but who did not support a constitutional monarchy, he wanted a republic, so he proclaimed one. He went ahead and hung out a window and said, there's a republic, and that was it. Ebert's attempts at preserving the old Hohenzollern monarchy were over. And there he is. There's Scheidemann proclaiming the Republic. Someone's colorized it for us. Because of this, the Social Democrats were seen as the leaders of the new republic, but that is really a poison chalice. Blame fell to them for the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, even though it was the army which gave the go-ahead to sign the Treaty of Versailles. You have everyone from monarchical forces to the Nazis to communists to just generally speaking, the German people really hated this treaty. And they blamed the government for it. The army and the old Hohenzollern bureaucracy, they were really sort of the power in post-World War I Germany. And they were incredibly opposed to these democratic reforms. They didn't like them one bit. The army, it would turn out, is the true center of political power in Weimar. And there were reasons for that, which we'll see as we continue on. But I think it's important to note that this is a crucial difference between Germany in 1923 and the United States in 2021. You know, the army being the sort of font of power, the true power, is just not the case here today. In fact, we've seen top military officials, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, commit to a peaceful transfer of power and commit to democracy continuing as it has since the dawn of this republic. And so we really need to be cognizant of the fact that in this country, in the United States, the military is still subordinate to the civil government. And that is a very important distinction between 1923 Germany and 2021 United States. So we're going to go ahead and continue on. I think that we've kind of covered that. However, I do think, real quick, this is a good point, that the failure of the socialists to subordinate the army would turn out to be the fatal flaw of the Weimar Republic. They would later go on to support Hitler in the 1930s, and that would bring on the Third Reich. Still, that was a ways off, and as of 1923, Germany was a republic with a wonderful constitution, a very liberal document. You can see here, they issued it in pamphlets. Lots of school children would have read it. However, no matter how tight the document was, it was still just a document. A constitution is not a magical piece of paper. You know, it is not sort of divine intercession. You know, it doesn't operate on its own. A constitution, just like any law, only works if the people believe that it works, if the people are committed to it and they agree on its principles. You know, we might agree on different interpretations of the Constitution, or we might disagree on how to interpret the Constitution in the United States today, but the vast majority of Americans agree on the basic principles of constitutional democracy. We agree that there is freedom of speech. We agree that there is freedom of religion. We agree that birthright citizenship, we might think that it shouldn't exist, but we agree that it is there in the 14th Amendment. You know, so these are things that the courts have ruled. These are things that the American people tacitly accept. We accept the Electoral College, even if we disagree with it. We accept the legitimacy of it. We accept that there is an upper chamber and a lower chamber of Congress. One has 2 representatives from each state. That's the Senate. One has proportional representation. So these are things that we all sort of tacitly accept. Whether we've ever articulated our acceptance of them or not, we sort of understand them. This was not necessarily the case in 1923 Germany. People didn't necessarily believe that the government was legitimate, or they didn't necessarily respect it the way that government authority is respected in modern America by the vast majority of Americans. The insurrection is obviously an exception to that. So that's another crucial difference between then and now. And there we have the United States Constitution. You can't really read it, but that's okay. If you want to read it, you can go on Wikipedia and find it. And we're talking about, again, the majority of Americans still believe in the rule of law. So now let's talk a little more about the Treaty of Versailles. The fact that German society didn't agree on the rule of law meant that by the time of the Beer Hall Putsch in November of 1923, that the very legitimacy of the Weimar Republic was widely questioned. Now, we're going to see that there was some increased support for the Weimar Republic and for the government in Berlin around this time, and we'll get to why. Kind of spoil it for you. It has to do with the fact that France invaded. But there's still widespread skepticism and widespread questioning of the legitimacy of the Republican government. when people feel unfairly treated, I think that that's to be expected. And certainly the Treaty of Versailles, I think people really resented it and really felt that it was illegitimate, and therefore any government that signed it was illegitimate because it was so burdensome on the German people. I think that the fact that there are legitimate grievances in 1923 Germany against the Treaty of Versailles, and that therefore they kind of view the government as illegitimate because of those grievances, is an argument that has a parallel to an argument that is made by the insurrectionists on Capitol Hill, who feel very aggrieved that that this election they believe was stolen from them. I think that it's important, though, to note that there is a massive difference between the realities of economic stagnation and economic catastrophe in Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles and the Stop the Steal movement, and that is that one was based in material reality, 1923 Germany, 4 billion marks for a loaf of bread, but one is not. There is absolutely no basis in reality for claims that this election was stolen. And so I think that that's where we need to make sure that we're sort of drawing those parallels, but also recognizing that they are very different. So let's talk about the Nazi Party and the German far right in 1923. It was not as organized as you probably think it is, and we're going to get into that a little. The Nazi Party in 1923 was almost completely contained to Bavaria, and it was virtually unheard outside of it. So there was no real national presence for Hitler or the Nazi Party. And even within Bavaria, it was not the main political movement. It wasn't the most prominent or successful. Even among the far right, it was one of many movements at this time. But Hitler thought that this was a place to start. If he could start with Bavaria, if he could unite the Bavarian government with regional militias and, sort of consolidate his power within Bavaria, then he could take the movement nationally. And that's really what he wanted to do. He was playing the long game even in 1923. So the Nazi Party would eventually become a single entity, which would be centralized and consolidated in the person of Adolf Hitler, but that was still a little ways away. There's Hitler as a young man around the time of the Beer Hall Putsch. That photo is dated from the early 1920s. That is him in his military uniform. So Hitler sees an opportunity in 1923. You've got all of this economic crisis in Germany. You have France invading. You have, the legitimacy of this democratic government being widely questioned, and a lot of people really not feeling that it has any sort of legitimacy. So he thinks, all right, this is my moment. There's no real historical conditioning for democracy in this or the nascent democratic institutions. So Hitler's thinking, I got this. This is an important distinction between then and now. In the United States, you got to keep in mind that in 1923, Germany was very, very new at democracy. The first German elections really took place, I believe, in 1920. Okay, so you're talking about 3 years. The first American elections took place 240 years ago, you want to talk about 1776 to now if you want to just use those sort of numbers for democracy in the United States. There has been some form of democracy in this country since its inception nearly 250 years ago. And that's a very important distinction. Now, I'm not saying that American democracy has always been universal or perfect. In fact, universal suffrage is very recent, dating to the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act. But there has been some form of democracy in this country since its inception. And that is a very, very key difference because that was 250-ish years ago compared to 3 years ago in 1923 Germany. The French occupation on the Ruhr began to unite the German people in support of the Republican government in Berlin, not because they were necessarily small d Democrats at heart, but because no one wants to be invaded. No one wants their country to be invaded by another country. So I kind of equate this to if Canada invaded and occupied Detroit. I think that Americans would be very, very outraged at that. And indeed, we saw Americans put aside political differences when we were attacked on 9/11. And so we've seen that within our own lifetimes, that the country can come together when attacked by an outside enemy. Hitler saw this happening, and he was concerned because Hitler needed fragmentation. Hitler needed social division in order for his movement to succeed. And in fact, he warned, and I quote, not down with France, but down with the traitors of the fatherland, down with the November criminals, unquote. And so Hitler really wanted to make people keep their eye on each other, the enemy within, not pay attention to France, which had invaded. He thought he could deal with France after he came to power in Germany. And indeed he did 20 some years later. So the consolidation of far-right power within Bavaria, though, is something that is worth looking at. Ernst Röhm was a German military officer and close political ally of Hitler's. You can see him right here. You've probably heard of him before, but we're not going to discuss him too much. What you need to know about him in terms of the Beer Hall Putsch is that he was really an organizational genius and able to help consolidate these various far-right factions into one cohesive movement. In September of 1923, an even stronger group formed, and Hitler was one of three leaders, though he was probably the most prominent of them all. That's a little bit different than what we see in the United States in 2021. As far as I can tell, the American far right has yet to coalesce in any real way. It's still largely pulled from disparate political factions with various interests. One of them is white nationalists. Another would be anti-government militias. And then you have what I would call militant libertarians. But there are others as well. The difference is they're not centralized, they're not one group, they're very, very autonomous organizations that we saw kind of working in concert, I think, on the 6th of January. Certainly investigations will sort of see how coordinated they were, but it certainly appears at this point that they were working in concert by organizing on far-right platforms like Parler. But generally speaking, they are very, very autonomous and very, very disparate. That's very different than what Hitler was hoping to achieve in 1923, which is unifying the far right under the Nazi banner. And indeed, he would go on to do that. But, you know, that's a good point to make as well, is that we see what happens when the far right coalesces, because that's what happened after 1923. And that led to the rise of the Third Reich, the Holocaust, the Second World War. So there are some similarities, though. And one is a charismatic leader. You see there the United States President, Donald Trump. He is president for, at the time of me recording this, 2 more days. And regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, regardless of what you think about what he says or his politics, I think it's important to acknowledge that he is a charismatic leader. People like him. People listen to him and they are riveted by him speaking. Now, I know what you're thinking if you are on the left, which is, how is that possible? Because the man could hardly form a sentence. Well, I agree, but that's really a different conversation for a different day. Right now, we just want to accept and acknowledge that he is a charismatic leader with a lot of people who like what he has to say, are riveted by him, are empowered by him. He knows how to fire up a crowd, and he has a substantial following in this country. Another similarity between, I think, Trumpism, the far right, and 1920 or in 2021, and the sort of German far right in 1923, is that there is this desire for a return to a bygone era in which the nation was great. You know, Make America Great Again harkens back to an era when America was, to the minds of the people who support Donald Trump, you know, internationally respected. The military was strong. The sort of average person could get ahead. Now, who they define as the common man or the average person, I think is important to discuss. Some, you know, and I'm not going to do that right now, but it is important to acknowledge that not everyone is included in that sort of, you know, everyman, common man collective. And it was the case in Germany as well in the 1920s, as we would see. You know, obviously they didn't include Jews in that, they didn't include communists in that, among many others. And we also see that there is a commitment to violence to achieve these political goals. So political violence is not ruled out. Now, I think it's very, very important to stop here for a minute and to say not all Trump voters, right? you cannot tar all Trump voters with the same brush as those who staged an insurrection on the 6th of January. You just can't do it. It's not fair. There's a massive difference between voting for Donald Trump and then trying to overthrow the US government. And we really need to be clear about that. But that being said, there is a willingness of some within the Trump coalition to engage in political violence. And we did see that on the 6th of January. So now we're up to the main event, the Beer Hall Putsch, okay? So let's talk about this. The situation in Bavaria has deteriorated, as we talked about. Now, by September of 1923, Bavaria is under control of 3 men, all of whom are very, very anti-Republican, very, very anti-democratic, and very, very anti-government. And when I say government, I mean the Berlin government. One of them is General Otto von Lossow, who was the commander of the German army in Bavaria. Colonel Hans von Seisser, who you can see here, was the head of the state police. And Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the state commissioner. Okay, von Kahr is sort of probably the most powerful one. I think of him as kind of like a governor. Kahr himself was a German nationalist who wasn't too far politically from Hitler, although he wasn't a supporter of Hitler's. But that's going to become important later on, and you'll see why. Flat out, refused to accept the state of emergency, Kahr did, and so he instituted his own. In reaction to this, Berlin orders von Lossow to arrest various far-right leaders and to suppress the Nazi newspaper in Bavaria. But von Lossow is a lukewarm Hitler supporter and refuses, so Berlin sacks him. They put in their own guy in charge of the army in Bavaria. And Kahr says, no, I am in charge of Bavaria. And so he declares that von Lossow will retain command of the troops in Bavaria. So here you have something that's probably more akin to what happened in the Civil War in the United States than it is to what's happening today, where you essentially have a state government in open rebellion against the central government. Now, of course, the central government in Berlin doesn't like this. They warn Hitler and the Bavarian government leaders that any armed rebellion will be met with force, which, of course, we see later that it was. But Hitler doesn't care. His followers are demanding action. He feels like he has to go. And so this is where things are, we're committed to this course of action if you're Hitler and the Nazis at this point. Like, they are really, this train has left the station, as far as they're concerned. But Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser are a little bit more pragmatic, I think. And they saw that any opposition to the central government would result in their ruin, the ruin of their political careers, the ruin of their political movement. And they warned Hitler that this was going to happen. So Hitler kind of knew that they weren't on side, but he knew that he needed them on side in order for his revolution to succeed. And so he plotted to kidnap them and force them to do his bidding. And that is exactly, I think, what, to sort of go back to 2021 into the modern era, what the Trump insurrectionists were hoping to do. Because again, the purpose of this video is to sort of link the past to the present. And again, it's not a perfect parallel, but I think that what you saw on Capitol Hill earlier this month was insurrectionists trying to use force to coerce legitimate political actors to exercise legitimate political power on their behalf. In essence, they were trying to hold the government hostage in order to make them do their bidding. They weren't trying to overthrow the government in so much as they were trying to, take it over themselves. They were trying to get the legitimate political actors, those who can exercise legitimate political power, to exercise it in a way that benefited them. And so that's, we're kind of splitting hairs here, but I think it's important to note that. They wanted to use violence to force the legitimate government to do as they said, which of course makes it an illegitimate decision, action, but crazy people don't care, and Nazis don't care. And, so there you go. That's where we're at. And at about 8:45 p.m., so we're back in 1923 now. Sorry, I know that was not a smooth transition. But about 8:45 p.m. on the 8th of November, 1923, stormtroopers, Nazi stormtroopers surround I'm going to try and say this word, Bergenbraut Keller. That's actually really, really bad pronunciation, but it's close enough. And Hitler pushes his way into the hall. He's got his revolver drawn, and he says that, the National Revolution has begun. That's how he declares. He pushes his way to the podium where Carr has been speaking for about half an hour, and he marches Carr into another room. Now he threatens the crowd, which is about 3,000 people who have gathered to see Carr speak, and he threatens that if they are not quiet and if they try to leave, he will have a machine gun brought in. Now that's kind of a scary thought. I would just say that a scary thought too is that somebody in the United States in 2021 could probably make a similar threat because of our lax gun laws. That's a different conversation for a different day, but I do want to make that point. Now, one thing Hitler did do was he lied. He lied and said that the army and the police were marching, blah, 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 blah. He said that they were marching, quote, on the city under the swastika banner, unquote. But crucially, no one in the hall knew that was a lie. And this is something that Hitler's very good at. He's very good at telling very persuasive lies. He ordered Carr, Lossow, and Seisser into a private room where he demanded that they, form a Bavarian government sort of that was in his liking and that was going to do his bidding, and he threatened to shoot them if they didn't. They declined. They held firm. Now, Hitler wasn't welcomed warmly. I think it's important to know there were a lot of businessmen in the crowd who viewed him very unfavorably and urged the police to shoot. But one of the things that we see happen later on is that Hitler goes back out after these men refuse to form a new breakaway Bavarian government. And he announces that a new government's being formed anyway. And again, like I said, Hitler's very good at telling very convincing lies. And so he announces that this new government is being formed, and he starts talking to the crowd. And this is a crowd that was hostile to him when he came in. And keep in mind, this is a crowd whose lives he just threatened. But he starts to win this crowd over. He gives this fiery oration, and he is met with a sort of thunderous applause as he declares this new nationalist government. And it's really quite remarkable how he was able to turn the crowd to his favor and really win them over to his side so quickly. And it's terrifying when you think about that. And there are very few figures, I think, in world history who were as charismatic or as articulate or as convincing as Adolf Hitler. And thank God for it, because the man was probably the most evil human being that has ever existed. But it's really quite remarkable how quickly he was able to win over the crowd. So Hitler hears about a clash between some of his stormtroopers and one of the other fighting leagues, because keep in mind, again, that the far-right movement is not completely congealed yet. It's not completely coalesced. This is still a very nascent movement. And so he goes to investigate this and figures he can sort this out. This is his fatal mistake on the night of the 8th of November. He allows Lossow, Carr, and Seisser, the three Bavarian officials, to escape the beer hall. When he comes back, he's furious that they've been able to escape and that no plans were orchestrated for a march on Berlin, which is really what he wanted. He said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it whole hog. Like, I'm gonna march on Berlin. We're going to take over all of Germany. So he wasn't doing anything by halves this night. But, the German or the Bavarian officials escaped, and they declared that any sort of coup was illegitimate. Now, Röhm has occupied the war ministry, but the German troops were sort of drawing a cordon around it, and Hitler knew he had the support of some junior officers and enlisted men, but keep in mind that most officers at the time really resented him and his treatment of Lossow, and they really weren't fans of Adolf Hitler as a person. They might have had some sympathies with his political aims, but they weren't a fan of him. And this is, he's kind of banking on lower level people supporting him. He has very little support, if no support, well, very little support from the higher ups. I've included a photo of 2 Virginia police officers who were arrested for their role in the insurrection. And the reason I'm including them is so that we can kind of draw a link between what Hitler was expecting from sort of junior officers and enlisted men, and the fact that we do know that there are some white nationalists and far-right activists who have infiltrated American police departments and the military. And in fact, just yesterday, news broke that the National Guard was concerned that there might be a sort of inside job from one of the National Guard members assigned to protect DC during the inauguration, that they might, sort of commit an act of political violence. So we know that this is a problem in the United States, the same way that Hitler was hoping it would be a problem for the German Republic. So Kahr managed to escape, as I said earlier, and Hitler, realizing that the army and the police were not won over to his side as he had expected, they're starting to form a cordon around the war ministry. Lossow has gone, so he's frantically trying to formulate another plan. He needs to figure out what he's going to do, but he knows that he doesn't have the numbers to take on the army and the police. He was counting on their support. He's not getting it. Now, it is important to note here, as I said, that the police and the army have no love for the Republic. They just don't really like Hitler. So what's Hitler going to do? Well, let's find out. I'm kind of moving through these a little, guys. This is my first one. So Hitler decided to march with Ludendorff, a famous and revered German general of the Great War, which was the First World War. He was going to march through the streets. He believed if he took Ludendorff that the military wouldn't fire on him. It's now the next morning. So the push has continued through the night. We're now into the morning of the 9th of November. Hermann Göring marches with the Nazis this day, and he comes to a bridge that he needs to cross the river that runs through Munich. And he says he's going to shoot hostages that he has at the rear of the advancing column. Now, nobody really knows if he actually had hostages. Again, Nazis lie. I mean, that's just something you need to sort of get through your head right now if you don't already know this. Nazis are really good at lying. But it worked, and the police allowed the Nazis to cross the river and to advance to the war ministry. It took about an hour for them to get there, which is really a remarkably short amount of time when you think about it. You've got these stormtroopers marching through the city, basically, undeterred by any sort of forces. So they reach the war ministry where shots are fired. Now, no one knows who fired first once they reached the war ministry. Was it the Nazis? Was it the German military? I can't answer that. But within 60 seconds, the streets were crowded with fallen bodies, and 16 Nazis and 4 police officers were dead. Hitler was not wounded, but he did fall to the ground and dislocate his shoulder. He tried to slither away. He sort of turned tail and ran. Hitler was a lot of things, but he was a coward, and he really wanted to preserve himself over the revolution. So he was arrested 2 days later. 2 hours later, after the shots were fired, Rome surrendered the war ministry, and the push was over. That was it. That's it. That was done. Hitler failed. We can all go home, right? No, we all know that's not true. So let's talk about the aftermath and lessons for the 21st century. All right, the justice system of Weimar. It's important that we talk about the justice system just briefly, because you need to know a little bit about it so that we can talk about the trial of Adolf Hitler. But we also want to kind of compare it to our own justice system, because I think that there are some differences that need to be acknowledged that I hope can calm and alleviate some of your fears if you are afraid that the justice system isn't going to hold people to account. So the Socialist Republicans failed to purge the judiciary of reactionary authoritarian elements. And so we had seen prior to 1923, 1924, which is when the trial was held, that treason laws were applied very differently to supporters of the new republic and to far-right elements. Far-right elements were treated much more leniently when accused of treason. Now, this far-right capture of the judiciary is similar in some regards to modern America, where Trump and McConnell have stacked the courts. Now, the difference is that I don't think it's fair to call every single Republican appointee far right. Some of them are, but a lot of them are sort of your run-of-the-mill conservatives. And it's very important to sort of differentiate between conservatives and even, extremely conservative thinkers. And like Justice Alito, for example, and a Nazi. Like, this is a very important distinction to make. You might not like the religious right, you might not like Justice Alito or Justice Thomas, but they're not Nazis. It's very important that we make these distinctions here, because the number of Americans who are part of these far right movements, QAnon or white nationalist or militia movements, even the number of Trump voters who are part of these far right movements is very, very small relative to the whole population or relative to the number of people who voted or supported Donald Trump. And so I say that not to sort of minimize what has happened, but to really try and put things in perspective a little so that you can kind of understand that maybe things aren't as dire as we think they are. They are bad. They are bad. That is not to be debated. They are bad. But they might not quite be the existential crisis that they were in 1923. Now, however, the courts showed a fidelity to the rule of law. This is in America. Our courts have showed a fidelity to the rule of law. And you see that with the way that they have dismissed Trump's bogus claims of election fraud whenever they've encountered them. So that is encouraging. Our courts are still very, very dedicated to upholding the law. We might not always agree with how they interpret the law, but they are dedicated to upholding it. And I think that that is something that we can be very proud of, that we can be very grateful for, that we can take some solace in. But still, the far right capture of the courts is concerning to me as a socialist, as a left-wing activist, and it should be concerning to, I think, most people. But one lesson I think that we will see is that, or one lesson we have seen is that those courts still have a fidelity to the rule of law. Now, another lesson I think that we'll soon see is that would-be seditionists can be emboldened by licenses. And I'm going to show you that here in a little bit. And so we need to make sure that these courts are punishing those found guilty of their role in the Capitol insurrection to the fullest extent of the law. That is something we're going to want to see. That is something we didn't see in 1924 in Germany, because keep in mind, we're in 1924 now. The trial happens the next year. So Hitler saw this trial as a platform from which he could espouse his odious views and which would bring him whole lots of renown. It would really raise his profile. Hitler, far from being afraid of the trial, really, really looked forward to it and really saw it as an opportunity. And it worked. He became an internationally renowned figure. Keep in mind that Hitler was really only known within Bavaria prior to 1924. Suddenly, he's in an international spotlight. He also used this as a way to discredit Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser by linking them to his failed efforts. And I think that we're going to see, we'll come back to that point, put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to that point in a minute. Anyway. How did Hitler manage to use the trial to his benefit? Well, the trial was not as structured as you or I probably think of trials. He was allowed to interrupt whenever he liked. He was allowed to cross-examine witnesses at will. Hitler and his defense team were even allowed to sort of decide what was released to the public and what was sealed. So, this was not a trial as you or I would really understand it. It didn't operate as a trial as you and I would understand it. Now, Hitler was utterly unrepentant of what he did. He said, quote, "There is no such thing as high treason against the traitors of 1918, unquote." And you can go ahead and read the rest of the quote there if you want. But I'm going to skip ahead by skipping back to that point I told you to put a pin in. I told you, how he managed to discredit Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser. This is very similar to what I think Trump and Cruz and Hawley are guilty of right now. But I'm going to caveat that with this important legal note that no one has been convicted of a crime with regards to the 6th of January, and that Trump, Hawley, and Cruz, the three men that I mentioned, have not been charged with any crime or any wrongdoing. Trump was impeached, however. But what I'm getting at, the point that I'm trying to make while I cover my own ass legally here, is that Trump and Hawley and Cruz might not have approved of the violence, or they might have, and I think that we'll see, but I think that they have said they don't approve of the violence. And so I'm going to go ahead and take them at their word in this moment and say that Trump, Cruz, Hawley, they disapprove of political violence. But it's important to note that much like Carr, Lausau, and Seisser, who disapproved of the political violence of the 8th and 9th of November in 1923, that Cruz, Hawley, and Trump had the same goals in the end. They wanted to see the overturning of a free and fair election, the same way that the triumvirate in Bavaria in 1923 had many of the same goals as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Now, I'm not trying to say that Trump or Hawley or Cruz are Nazis, far from it, but I am saying that there is a parallel here about how legitimate political actors, even as they disavowed political violence, did share the same goals as the insurrectionists. Now, Hitler was already beginning to understand the reasons of the Putsch failure, and he vowed not to make the same mistakes again. Now, years later, he would call it, quote, the rashest decision of my life, unquote, and it really was. He really understood that there wasn't a whole lot of planning that went into this, and that was a problem for him. And that we saw on the 6th of January. Whatever level of coordination and planning there was, there clearly wasn't a lot of organization among the insurrectionists on the 6th of January. In the end, Hitler was found guilty, and I said here in the text that though the law mandated a life sentence, I don't think that that is accurate. I think what it is that the maximum sentence was a life sentence, but that the minimum sentence was like 5 years. And that's what Hitler was sentenced to. Even then, the judges thought it was too tough of a sentence. And so the presiding judge made Hitler eligible for parole after 6 months, and he was out of jail by the end of the year. So by the end of 1924, Hitler was a free man. Now let's talk a little about the consequences of the Beer Hall Putsch, because this is where I think that we can look at the lessons for the 21st century. So a lot of opponents of the Republic, a lot of far-right German nationalists, and Hitler himself took note of how leniently he was treated. And he sort of took that as a tacit endorsement of his actions and his beliefs. Though the push failed, it did make Hitler a national and even international figure, and he made him a hero to a great many people in Germany. And so every year thereafter, even though it was a failure, because of these reasons, Hitler went back to Munich, went back to the Beer Hall, and celebrated and commemorated the anniversary of the failed putsch. Even during the Second World War, Hitler would make his pilgrimage to Munich every November. So what lessons are there for us here in the 21st century? Well, I think one thing we know now is that intelligence agencies and law enforcement must do more. We have to act preemptively. We cannot wait for the next insurrection. We cannot wait for the next attempted coup, or even just the next violent action. We really have to go ahead and start taking the threat of far-right white nationalist violence seriously now. We have known for at least a decade that this was a rising and increasing threat to America, but we've done very little to counter it. So we need to go ahead and get on that right now. We also need for police forces, for the military, for intelligence agencies, for law enforcement, whoever it may be, to purge their ranks of far-right activists, white nationalists, and the like. We know that there are some in there. I don't want to say that it's most. I don't want to say that it's all. Again, I really want to avoid from painting from too broad a brush or from sort of damning everyone because of the actions of a relative few. But I do think it's important that we acknowledge that there has been an infiltration of the police forces and of the military by far-right activists, and that we need to go ahead and start purging the ranks of those people. Those guilty of insurrection must be punished to the fullest extent of the law. I think that that is one of the most consequential lessons of the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler would not have been able to take over Germany had he been imprisoned for life. And it's shocking to me that he wasn't until you start delving into what was going on in Germany in 1923. We need to make sure in the United States that we are not repeating those mistakes. Those people who are charged with a crime resulting from the 6th of January need to be punished to the full extent of the law. Trials cannot be allowed to be used as platforms for defendants to espouse their views. Now, this is perhaps a little bit less pressing than it was in 1923, simply because, unfortunately for us, those views are able to be disseminated in any number of ways because of the internet and because of technology. So newspaper coverage isn't the only way to get your word out now. And so we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that while also balancing concerns regarding freedom of speech. Another thing I'm going to throw in here, because we talk about Trump voters and economic anxiety, and because we are in the middle of a very, very dire economic crisis in the United States right now, is that economic anxieties can lead to radicalization, but they don't have to. And I say this as sort of a warning to Democrats and to Joe Biden to not be afraid to send those $2,000 checks every month to the American people, to make sure that the American people are able to eat, to make sure that the American people are able to, afford a roof over their head and to pay rent. And it looks like Joe Biden is sort of understanding that. But I do think we need to talk about, the fact that, a lot of people take Ashley, I think her name was Ashley Babbitt, the 30-something-year-old woman who died at the Capitol. Bill Maher reported on his show on Friday that she had a payday loan that had an interest rate of like 160 or 170%, and that was really affecting her. And, talks about sort of her trajectory from an Obama-Biden voter to dying at the Capitol to keep Joe Biden out of office. And you can't attribute all of that to economic anxiety. And certainly, as I said earlier in this video, the economic anxiety of Trump voters is nothing compared to the economic anxiety of Germans in 1923. Bread is not $4 billion a loaf. So however bad it is, it's not nearly as bad as, it's just nowhere near as bad as what it was in Germany a century ago. But we do need to go ahead and I think acknowledge that, and sort of, because we have to talk about why these people are hurting and why 75 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. It might not be instructive to try and figure out the reasons or the why-fors of the people who stormed the Capitol, but the rest of Trump's voters, I think it's worth asking ourselves why they voted for that man. And it's not only economic anxiety, but it is partly that, I think. Now, another lesson, and I think that this is one that we can take heart in, is that our institutions, even though they were weakened by 4 years of Trump and Trumpism, they've held firm. And our institutions are strong and they're durable, and we've seen them work. We've seen the courts work. They don't always work the way that we would like them to on the left, but they work. We've seen the Electoral College. Again, I think it should be abolished, but it worked. It did its job. It didn't undermine the election. So we saw Congress certify the vote. Our institutions work. They uphold, or they've upheld themselves. They've withstood Trumpism. And so that is something that I think we can celebrate. Our institutions are older. Their roots are deeper. They are stronger than what they were in the Weimar Republic a century ago. There is a strong tradition of democracy in the United States, and that is something that I think we can all take heart in as well. That was not true a century ago in Germany. Our democracy goes back about 250 years. Theirs went back 3 years. So, I don't mean that in terms of American exceptionalism and to say that it can't happen here. Obviously, part of the reason I'm making this video is because I believe it can happen here. But I think that we also need to make sure that we keep perspective and that we look at the things that bulwark us from that happening here and that protect us from that happening here. That doesn't mean it can't, but it means it's less likely. And, another thing that makes it less likely is the fact that most Americans oppose what happened. If you look at the polling, most Americans are horrified by what happened on the 6th of January, and rightly so. We disagree on policy issues sometimes vehemently and sometimes to extreme degrees, but we tend to agree on the big issues: democracy, the rule of law, liberty. So that hasn't changed. because of Donald Trump. That hasn't changed because of the insurrection. And I think that it's important for us all to acknowledge that. The majority of Americans, the vast majority of Americans, still agree on the big questions. Still, democracy is fragile and not guaranteed, so the onus is on all of us, you, me, and every elected official and every citizen of this country to protect democracy and to protect the Constitution, and to do whatever we can to counter the rising tide of fascism and far-right activism and white nationalism within our borders and abroad. All right, that's it. That's it. You've made it this far. This video is a lot longer than I had planned on it being, so I appreciate it if you've stuck around to the end. I wish that I had a reward for you, maybe a cookie or a biscuit as they're called in Britain, but unfortunately I do not. And I just took an old picture I used on my blog as my background for this last slide. But I'm going to encourage you all to follow me on Twitter if you haven't already. I'm at Skylar Jordan. You can also follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Skylar Jordan, or just search Skylar Baker Jordan. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one on there. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it useful, or if you like my writing and you came here because of that, please consider go ahead and becoming a patron. I really appreciate all of you who have so far. It means a great deal to me. It enables me to continue putting out content like this, to continue putting out the writing that I put out that you know so well. And so I really appreciate it. If you can't, please don't feel obligated. You know, I understand money's tight for everyone, but if you can throw a few dollars a month my way, I greatly appreciate it. And as always, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for your time. I'm very, very humbled that you chose to spend an hour with me. And until next time, bye-bye, everybody.